Hello and welcome to Turning Point Tactics, the competitive Killteam 40k podcast, focused on giving you the strategies and tactics to seize initiative every turning point. I'm your host Ryan and I'm joined by the Patrick to my SpongeBob, Connor. How you doing this evening, Connor?
I'm good, thanks, Ryan.
We're also joined for the second time by Clostry, a man so competitively gifted he brought a knife to a gunfight just to even the odds. How you doing this evening, Laurie?
I'm fine, thank you for having me.
Awesome stuff. So clearly we had a bit of a technical snag last time, which I apologise for, and we ended up losing the entire end of the podcast, which had all our tactical tips, Q&A and all that sort of stuff, and it was really good chat, and we ended up losing all to the internet gods. So we had to get you back on to hopefully try and get all that good stuff that you said into one place and capture it for everyone out there, because a whole bunch of it was questions from the patrons. We want to make sure that we're supporting them as much as they support us. So we're going to roll straight into it, if that's okay with you, and we're going to go into the tactical tip of the day, which we should have done obviously last week, but it's Tactical Tuesday today. We need to start with tactical tip. So as we have you on, do you have your top tip for competitive play?
Yeah, so my very first tip is just play your team and practice. If you are going to a tournament and you selected what you want to bring, then just roll with it. Try to get in as many games as you can. Know the stats by heart. That's the most important thing, because getting the book out, looking at stats is time consuming, to be honest.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, I think, which people underestimate how much time it can cost you during a tournament. When you only have there's particularly on a clock, when you have 45 minutes of your time, if you're checking rules, that's going to be on your time. So making sure you know it so you can just bring it out and do it and not make mistakes is really, really helpful, I think, for people. Anything else you think?
Also, what was really helpful for me is playing on TTS. Sadly or not sadly, my local meta is still shaping up. And if I want to practice really competitively, then I have to sit down at my computer and fire up TTS, which is another game slightly than the normal tabletop variant. Don't get me wrong, I just love pushing my normal figures around and I prefer that version of the game, but TTS is a good replacement for that, especially with the awesome mods that we have around for the table, etc. It's really easy to set up, and it actually allows you to look outside your local meta and play with other players, play with Americans, play with the Spanish guys, terrifying as it is, or the Polish guys, and get a taste of how they are thinking about the game, how they are approaching the different teams and the different setups. And even if I would play a mirror match, I usually try to swap to another team, and I just want to see how my opponent thinks about the team that I've been playing with, and I always try to learn from those experiences. So, for example, if I know that I have a tournament coming up and my deck ops are not selected already, I don't know which three I'm going to sort of always pick. I just practice and go with rounds that I know, for example, Courier might not be the best option, but let's roll with it. Let's try it out. Or plant. What's the new one for plant signal beacon?
Plant transponders?
Transponder, yeah, that's it. So I personally don't like that tech ops, but I will try it now and again, and maybe something will switch in me, and suddenly I will realize that, that's the best tech ops out there. Yeah, getting out of your comfort zone, trying stuff, playing a lot, not just getting stuck in your local meta. Maybe these are the most important tips that I can come up with.
I think that's really, really good advice. And like, just on the learning to play your team and playing it really, really well. So like, the advice I'll give to sort of all people that are getting into Killteam for the first time is find a team that you like and stick with it for a while until you've actually learned that team. Then think about moving on to another one. But when you start to get to the stage where you've learned a few teams, I think it's fine then to start jumping around and trying out new stuff, because what it's going to do is it's going to let you learn what your opponent can do and learn your opponent's rules. However, in the run up to the tournament, I think you need to go back to that comfort zone and start focusing back on your own team that you intend to take, because it's so easy to forget rules or miss or forget the combos and the plays that you've made unless you've regularly repeated for it. Now, how much time it takes for you to get back into the mindset is completely down to individual. You might be a savant and you can do it in a single game. You might be someone that actually needs to do it in 50 games. That's down to the individual. But I think there's definitely a balance to be had between learning what else is out there and what the opponent can do, but then actually getting the reps in on the team that you want to take on the day. Because as you just said then, learning attack ops, learning when it would be good to take it and learning when it would be bad to take it, the terrain and the maps you might be playing on, all that sort of stuff, is all going to play into it. So I think that's a really good point. And we're going to come back onto TTS in a bit, because we've got some stuff to potentially help you out if you're looking to get onto TTS and do that a bit more. We have some tools and some stuff that you can use, which will hopefully mean you can get more access to more of the game sooner if you want to get on and start playing against those other metas that are out there. Okay, so the next part of this podcast, we're going to go through a bunch of questions. So what we did is we went to our Patreon and we said, hey guys, we got Clostry on, the latest Warhammer World Champion. What questions do you have that you would like to get answered? And we collated a whole bunch of them, so we got quite a few to go through, about 7 or so. So what we'll do is we'll go into that, but what I will say to anyone out there that's listening is Patreon is one way to support us, and we absolutely love the fact that people are doing that, and honestly, it means the world to us that you do. But the other way you can support us in a really simple way is just by hitting the subscribe button. For those that don't know, for YouTube, if you get to 1,000 subscribers, that's when they can start monetizing your page and start giving you a bit of support that way. So we're currently a third of the way there, and it's on a quite a rapid growth, and we would love to be able to see us get all the way. So if you can't do the financial commitment of Patreon, just hitting that like and that subscribe and sharing it amongst your friends, very much appreciated. But back to the Q&A that we're promising. Straight into the first question: how to move up the board successfully, keeping yourself safe while also being able to threaten. So do you have any thoughts on how you're able to position models up the board and get those threat ranges up there?
First of all, if you are playing a team with any sort of silent weapon profiles, you are lucky. Good job. Try to deploy them into not necessarily a shooting gallery, but give them a shooting lane that they can control from the get-go, and they can threaten because they are in concealment behind heavy. They can't be fired at easily, at least, and they can dish out punishment. If you don't have that, and you have indirect weapons, crack grenades, for example, or Vane, if you happen to play with Stealth Riders, then try to hold them back in the first turning point. Try to activate them as your last figures, or even if your last activations are approaching and there are no good targets that you are willing to trade that figure for, because you are probably trading them in. If you are getting out activated, just hold them back. They will be a threat in TP2 as well. Your opponent has to keep that grenade's threat range in mind. So you don't necessarily have to jump the gun the first opportunity that you have. I'd say that most of the time the presence of a threat might be bigger than the actual threat. So losing something like that for a lesser target might not be viable. And if you had those pieces in mind, then you can try to set up non-reciprocal shooting as well. So it means a shooting instance where your figure is obscured to your target or to other enemies' figures, or your opponent's other figures, but you clear the obscurity from that from your own figure. That way you can keep them safe. For example, if you're playing against Intercession, there's the threat looming over your head from the Wrath of Vengeance tactical ploy when they shoot back when they die. But you can actually deny that if you set up a non-reciprocal shooting, because your figure is obscured, not a valid target for shooting. So there they go off the board without firing from Vengeance. And maybe if you see a good striking opportunity early in the turning point, just take it. If you can hit 3 or 4 guardsmen with a frag grenade or a frag profiled grenade launcher, just do it. Odds are you will injure them, and I'd say 4 targets for frag is a really good point to just make the aggressive move and shoot it, because if you are injuring them or killing them, they won't be able to shoot back, or at least those figures. So that's a worth a trade.
There's a few points that I'd like to sort of just build on from what you drawn out there, because there's so much good stuff in what you just said. So the first one is the holding back indirect weapons. I think it's not just your indirect weapons as well, it's all sorts of forms of threat. So Connor and I spoke about on a previous podcast where we talked about keeping your opponent honest. So if you have for instance, you have an infiltrate option, well then any single one of those grenade guys could be a threat. They have to constantly be measuring threat ranges from all of them. And as soon as you move that model forwards, that's when they can ignore it and move on. But same can be said about the plasma gun that you have in your back line or whatever. As soon as you use that threat, it's gone, and it might be that they're just trying to bait you out. So you're playing against Imperial Guard, and they're going to throw a weedy guardsman onto an objective just to try and get you to use that threat, and then they can position other models more aggressively ready for next turn, knowing that big threat has gone. So keeping your opponent honest by keeping those threats right until the end is a really good way of making sure that people respect your own ball control, because as long as they're out there, they have to be thinking about it. And the other thing, which is, and we'll talk about it again when we come to scouting step in a future episode, but forcing your opponent to take the first turn helps reduce that activation advantage that they have. So you end up then having to fight a little bit harder. You know, they don't have quite so many threats at the end of the game. So you know the safe moves. You know when you can move into heavy cover and not be in threat range if you're measuring against people. And you know when you're going to be moving out and it will be in threat range. Well, if you move that model last, they may only have 1 or 2 activations to be able to kill you. And that's a great way to be able to stop yourself from being taken out out early on anyway. Connor, do you want to go with the next question that we have?
Yeah, sure. And actually, Clostry, I think you're an ideal person to ask here because you've got loads of practice with intercession, and I know you play your brother who plays Pathfinders, and our question today is how do you play versus a team that out-activates you on turning point 1 and does not expose models until you have finished activating?
Oh yeah, painful memories. So the first thing is try to avoid being shot. This is the most important stuff. When it comes to your example, intercession against Pathfinders, if you can avoid getting shot in TP1, you are doing a perfect job, because they will have less of an opportunity to table you. For instance, intercession, it might be worth it to just sacrifice an early victory point lead if you can keep your whole team intact and surge out TP2, get in your charge ranges, or you move dash and shoot from 2 inches, etc. So just be super conservative, be really cagey, and try to deny shooting angles and opportunities for your opponent. And if you're not playing an elite team, but for example you play Corsairs against Wedguard or Starstriders against Wedguard, etc., so you are being out-activated but not by that much, you can try to move up the board, but only do it with figures you are willing to lose. So you can sacrifice a normal guy for a 2 VP lead on loot and salvage, or just any looting mission at the moment, if you can get the figure onto one of the opponent's home objectives, so something that's in your opponent's territory, and loot it before he does, because that's one looting option off the table in his territory. It means he has 1 less VP available. You already have 1 extra, so it's creating a 2 VP lead. Maybe that should be enough, to be honest.
I've got a few things that I think is worth chucking in there as well, having played a little bit of elites myself, but I think there's often a desire to be quite aggressive with elites, and people feel like I've got 3 activations, I have to use all 3. But there's also a part of it which is just keeping an elite alive is far more valuable in the long run. So if you lose an elite on turn 1, well, you've lost 9 APL worth of actions by doing that. So you might think, oh, I'm going to get 1 shot here and I might kill this single guardsman. But if that then means that model dies, well, you could have potentially been double shooting for the next 3 turns and killed 6 guards, potentially. So I think it's worth just looking at it in a sense of, is it worth throwing this model away right now, or yes or no? Because the other thing they can do is they can babysit objectives with 3 APL, and your opponent has to commit quite a lot to be able to then take that objective off you. So sometimes playing a little bit conservatively, putting them back, and even keeping them alive on 1 wound, it's still just as scary as it would be on full health, because if you can ignore injury or whatever it is, then you can still go out and do quite a lot of explosive damage and kill people with that model. I think that's something that's what's worth considering is, do you have to throw this model away right now, or can you keep him alive and keep your opponent having to work for the objectives and the kills and that sort of stuff, and keep it as a credible threat? Again, reinforcing the point that's going to keep your opponent honest. All right, Connor, I think that's that covered that one quite nicely. Do you want to go into the next one?
Yeah, the next one's actually a very similar question, just a different angle on it, if you will. So how do you play versus a team that can outshoot you from a team comp perspective and is also playing extremely safely on turning point 1, i.e. they're not scoring many objectives, but they're positioned in a way that you can't punish them, but they could punish you if you were going to move out?
If your opponent is playing really cagey and safe, most of the time you can create a VP lead, turning point 1. And if you can do it, which is hard, in a way that you are not necessarily sacrificing a figure just to do it. So maybe you are moving out, but your opponent has to commit to getting rid of that figure or getting onto that objective. 1, it's an opportunity to set up a bait. 2, maybe they will just be cagey for the whole first turning point, and that way you create a VP lead, and maybe from TP2 you will get those shooting angles, those shooting opportunities, and with the VP lead you've already created, you can get that momentum going, and once you get the VP lead and start getting rid of their figures, you are getting the match.
I don't really have too much to add on this one, to be honest, because I think that's all pretty good advice. Having played a bit of Blooded recently, it's regular that I'm going against like Vetguard or whoever, and you know you're not going to be able to outshoot them. But I think you just got to play into your team strengths a little bit. If they're outshooting you, you're probably going to outdo them in melee. So I think you just have to sort of play for that turn 2, as you said. Like you just set up and maybe threat saturate for turn 2 if you can, and they know that, oh well, I can shoot that guy over there, but you're going to get a kill with someone over the other side of the board and that sort of thing. And just by doing that, you can really hurt them. So that's another way of doing it. But I think, to be honest, Clostry covered most of the points that I think is in there. Anything you want to add on that, Connor, or do you want to go into question 4?
I was just hoping Laurie could expand a little bit on his idea of bait there. You're trying to suggest you're leaving out something to try and force your opponent to play in a different style, like almost force a blunder from them.
Yes. So the first thing, if you have any defensive ploys, then you are in a good way to get on objectives, get sort of in your opponent's face, just halfway there, and rely on those ploys or rely on a medic, for example. So maybe you move up with a medic into a heavy cover mid-board. Then you present a threat to your opponent, maybe even a gunner or someone with a grenade, something valuable that they might try to go out of their way to shoot at. And then they might go out, shoot, your medic saves your guy, and then you have an opportunity to shoot back. Of course, it won't work against everyone, because if you know there's a medic, you will have to calculate with it. But it will present another thought process for your opponent, because you've moved up a threat on the board covered by a medic. If they are not trying to get rid of it, then it will stay there in TP2 again. So then in TP2, you might actually threaten them with it. Whereas in TP1, you just try to bait someone out of cover to get a shot back. Or, for example, with Starsiders, move on to objectives, get your Undoubted Explorer's ploy going, and you might survive a salvo from one shooting attack, and then shoot back from a different angle. Or the other thing is, if you really can't create any opportunities like this, just set up at least 2 threats on the board for TP2. So even if you lose initiative, or we are playing against Pathfinders and they just take it or activate before you, then you still have 2 valid options to retaliate with, and they will probably only get rid of one, not both of them. Try to avoid getting into a 2-inch bubble, both, or at least with your 2 threatening pieces. Try to separate them on the board as well, to have different angles into your opponent. So at that point, they will have to choose which one is the greatest against them in their mind, and we'll try to get rid of that, and then you just do in with the other.
I'm concerned that neither of you said go as aggressive as possible and die in a blaze of glory, so I might have to rethink my tactics there a little bit.
There's the offer striking opportunity always. So if you have an offer striking opportunity and angle, take it. A good offense is the best defense.
I think if you're playing a Hand of the Archon, that might be the way. Just see if you can eat yourself 10 inches across the board and throw as many grenades into the back line as possible. And you never know. Maybe it'll work. The option's always there.
Should we jump into question 4?
Yep.
So this question is now deployment, which is something we haven't quite yet covered. I know we've got to jump on it. It's the next thing to do. But so this Patreon asks, in the new critical ops missions, how do you approach deployment and specifically the group breakdowns? Do you have a certain set of heuristics that you're utilizing, e.g., deploy basic troops first, or is it very much match-up situation dependent?
So it most of the time depends on the board and the mission, and only after that on the opponent and the team they are bringing. But as a sort of rule number 1 is getting my indirect weapons and my big threats, for example, Plasma Gunner, into the last group that I'm going to deploy. So up until that point, my enemy has to keep guessing where they will go. But if there are spots in your deployment zone that are just obvious that you are going to deploy a certain figure there, don't be afraid to put those in your first deployed group. For example, if we go back to Starstriders, you have the Electromeister who can move dash and do a mission action for free. If there's an objective that he can grab in his first activation, then there's no point in keeping your opponent sort of guessing where he will go, because he will know where he goes. So just get rid of that. Get the Electromeister in your first group, first figure on the board, because both of you know where he will go. No point in keeping that information back. But most of the time it will depend on the actual layout and the opponent.
You talked a lot about keeping your opponent guessing there. Is there also an element of, if you say your indirect weapons and your heavy guns in that final group, when it comes to deploying them, your opponent's deployed 2 or 3 groups themselves, and you've got a bit more information yourself about where you want to put these models down?
Yeah, Exactly. So that way, if you know that there's a valuable target within reach or sort of within reach, then you can react to it with your big guns. Whereas if you put them down in the first group, then you can't react to your opponent's decisions.
There's one thing I'll throw in as well is you sort of touched on it there, is like don't move block yourself. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about like what is your first move and what's your last move. So he talks about where your threats are going to be and that kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of a good way of building your deployment is, right, what models are, like, plan your entire turn one, right? So what models are moving out first and where do they need to go to and how much movement do they need to get there? And then which models are going to move after that? So it might be that your plasma gun and whatever else are going to be your last models to move, and therefore they can be in the most restrictive spots because you know that everyone else is going to move out around them, and therefore their ability to move will be made by that. But there's also a few other, like, just, I guess, key principles. So where possible, if I can, I'm always going to put my model that's on engage in a place that's completely blocked by visibility, ideally next to a vantage point. And it might be that you go look at Octarius and you go, behind the doorway next to that little gap in the barricade wall is the only place where that plasma gun is ever going to go, and you can then put them there safely every time. And that might be the way to do it. But I think 100% what you said there is all the advice you need, and just make sure you're not move blocking yourself, because it is a little bit harder now with the deployment to plan ahead what you're doing and not accidentally misplay and put someone in the wrong place.
Yeah, and it can actually happen easier with the critical ops spec, because in the old version you just deployed your whole team and you could mix and match your team during your deployment time. But with the new rules, if you put a group down, they will stay there. So if you made a mistake, good job, you are stuck with it.
Yeah, and it might be worth just double checking with your opponent at the start. Is it okay if we can tweak the movement of these, or does it have to be absolutely perfect at the beginning? Because down the club on a Thursday and Friday, I'm pretty lax if someone wants to move models, and to be fair, I probably am pretty lax at a tournament as well. But someone might not be, so you probably want to check and make sure that you've agreed what the rules are on how you're going to do your deployment, because rules are written. Once the model's there, it ain't moving. So don't move block yourself.
Our next question is expanding on the attacker defender roll-off and choosing which board edge. And luckily we've got Laurie here to also add insight, but they just want a bit more advice and evaluation. So they ask, what steps do you take when evaluating which board edge you would like to take, assuming an asymmetric board layout and you are defender? I know some of this is Killteam dependent, and there are sometimes you just can't let the other team have a certain terrain feature. But what else are you doing and thinking when choosing a side? Are you trying to look at what your kill team will be doing on turning point 4?
So I don't really think that you can predict turning point 4 and plan ahead that much. Maybe turning point 2, something like that. But by that point, your best laid out plans will be gone. If your if your opponent knows what he or she is doing. So when it comes to choosing sides, nowadays I tend to look at early objective grabs and opportunities to just get a VP lead going on and build a momentum on that. After that, I would try to look at the board with firing lanes or shooting galleries in mind, either to avoid or to abuse. So if I can't get the side of the board that would be better for objective grabs, then I might switch my tactics up and I will go more aggressive and trying to shoot my opponent on the board. If there's, for example, a terrain piece that I absolutely have to deny my opponent for having it, that side is worse for objectives or moving up the board, then I will switch and I will focus on shooting. But if I don't have to do it, I will usually go for the objectives, and I try to plan my first turning point for every figure. Where's the desired place of my figures at the end of turning point 1? Do I have any of my opponent's figures that I absolutely have to either remove or stay the hell away from? And after that, have an idea of what to do in TP2. What's my mission? What tech ops did I choose? For tech ops, you actually have to plan ahead and know how can you meet the conditions and maximize. And all of this planning also requires you to have backup plans in place. So if you know that if you see your opponent moving up on one flank and one of your key figures just got unlucky, you rolled badly and you lost it, then try to have one or two figures in place from the mid of the board or from a bit further back on that flank to go in and sort of fill the gap and deny your opponent to capitalize on that breach they've done. You have to be flexible with your plans and maybe think about waves, for example. When it came to the old ITD missions, I played Intercession in a tournament, which was pure ITD, and most of the time I split up my team into fire teams. So I had either 2 or 3 of them. I tried to either separately move them up the board, 2 or 3 guys in a sort of group, separated in my mind that Group A has this objective, they will move up mid-board, they will score this stack up, and Group B will flank, will get into the enemy's backline, etc. So yeah, and within the group have layers. For example, when it comes to Intercession, for example, I usually try to play them with a front line and a back line. So I usually go with assault intercessors, 2 to 3, have them canvas my backline, canvas for my shooting guys. For example, against Legionnaires, they will be the shield that will keep the demonized anointed back and give my backline an opportunity to shoot the Legionnaires off the board. But if one of them fails, I try to fill the gap with another one, or even a backline or shooting guy just charge in or move closer and shoot.
I think it's a really good point you've sort of made there. I'm just going to reinforce it because I think it's worth doing. So from my perspective, I think everyone, when they first get to evaluating a board, they'll look at the board and they'll look at their deployment zone and they'll go, is this a good deployment zone? And they're only looking at that section of the board, right? So that might be the 3-inch strip at the back, or it might be the triangle, whatever. And they're trying to figure out, is there enough terrain in there to be able to keep their models safe and all that sort of stuff. And that's a great starting point, right? You need to make sure that you've got the right amount of space to safely deploy your models and keep everyone alive, right? So that's 100%, that's what you need to begin with. But where you need to move to is you need to start looking at the mid-board, right? So like you talked about then about how you're getting on objectives and how you're moving up and all that sort of stuff. And that's exactly what you need to do, right? You need to stop looking at your deployment zone. Once you know it's safe, i.e., can I get how many models I need to down in that area and not be alpha struck? Boom, love it, perfect. Then, okay, so how am I going to get onto this objective here, this objective here, this objective here? Because the way the new missions are built, the majority of the objectives are in the mid zone of the board, and you need to start looking at how you're going to get them. There's probably like 1 or 2 safe ones that you can get every turn on your side, but the ones that's going to win you the game is going to be the ones that are in the mid board or on your opponent's side, because VP is pretty easy to get now, right? So you need to start thinking how you're going to deny VP, and it's not going to be good enough just to let your opponent capture three points a turn every turn and rack up that VP. It's going to be very hard for you to win if you do that. So you need to think, okay, this is where I'm beginning, but where am I going to? How am I getting there? And which has the better route? So is there heavy cover for me to be able to use? Is there light cover that's protected by obscurity or visibility blocking from vantage, whatever it is, right? So look at that, plan your routes, as you say, plan that turn 1, figure out how you're going to get to those mid-board objectives, and then figure out how you're going to be able to get to your opponent's deployment if you need to be able to deny that VP. And I think that's the sort of, to summarize a little bit of, I think what you said is a really good way of doing board selection.
Cheers, guys. And our last question from our Patreon is actually a question specifically for Laurie, who knew you were coming. So he says, I've been looking at the last few events you've been playing in, and it looks as though you've made a major swap from elites, and he notes Phobos and Intercessors, into Star Striders. Are there any particular reasons for this? It'd be interesting to hear the thought process behind team selection, especially to jump from teams that perform so radically different.
Yeah, so I first started playing with elites because I wanted a lighter mental load. I don't think I could have handled a 14-figure red card, for example. I'm not sure even though. And keeping in mind that playing on a chess clock, for example, or playing 4 times, so we're not talking about 4-hour rounds where I have plenty of time to think through everything. That's why I started with elites, and I actually started with Legionnaires, but TTS tournaments are not in BCP. And after getting a taste with them, then I started playing Intercession a bit, and I took Intercession for LGT last year because I just wanted a lighter mental load for my first IRL tournament, and I knew that the team was solid, and they don't really have a lot of intricacies within the team itself. You have to actually just play the core of the game perfectly to win a tournament with them. I think that makes them a perfect starting point for anyone with Killteam if you are not rejecting the idea of playing with Space Marines, because the team itself doesn't have so many rules that you have to cram it into your brain and just utilize it every time. It doesn't have intricate mechanics within the team, or plays with 2-3 figures that you have to set up a turn ahead, etc. So that's why I chose them for LGT. After that, I picked Phobos for a local tournament because, as I mentioned, my local scene is still growing. I didn't want to stomp my opponents and just create a feel-bad experience for them when they came for a tournament. And I actually like playing with Phobos. They're just weak into elites, sadly, but I like the plays that you can make with them. After that, I went back to Intercession for an ITD tournament because I wanted to learn the ITD rules. ITD presents a different game when you compare it to Open, and I knew that I wanted a team that I'm comfortable with. Something that I won't have to learn along with learning ITD itself. And after that, I wanted to improve my time management when it came to handling multiple figures, so more than elite. I tried out different teams, and Starsiders just struck with me. I really liked playing them, so I made the decision to pick them up, practice with them, bring them to Warhammer World, and maybe I will go up to Red Cards next. I don't know. I just want to get better playing the game, so I tried to, for every tournament, I tried to set a goal that would help me improve myself. Winning or getting a good placement was secondary to that, to be honest. Of course, it feels good, but that wasn't really the main objective.
Awesome stuff. So, other quite interesting thing that's happened recently is we just released a open world map pack for all the 4 major worlds: Octarius, Chalnath, Nakmund, and Morok. There was a bit of conversation that came out of that, and there's one of the questions that was asked on the Patreon when I was talking about the map pack and showing it to them and having that sort of conversation was about the recent Spanish ruling by one of their TOs to say that the Fortify step in the scouting step, that Fortify option, can't be used on advantage. And sort of the question that came from that was, do you think that that's the right way to play, the wrong way to play? What's your thoughts on that as a decision? And then also, with the maps that you've just made, have you considered that and made that part of your map design? So I think it's a really interesting point to cover because it's a great question from one of the patrons, and I want to make sure that I give them the full answer and try to explain my thought process behind it. So when I was making these maps, I 100% considered that these match play changes are part of it now, which is why hopefully you'll see there should be sufficient heavy cover in the mid board so that those vantage points can't be too dominant. And that's pretty difficult to do, particularly on Octarius and Nakmund, because they naturally, the way the terrain is laid out, they're quite sparse and they're really hard to build boards for. But the idea being is that I think that it's part of the game and it's something that we have to learn to adapt to as competitive players, right? I don't think it's necessarily as bad as we thought it was. And I did a bit of reflection on it because the first reaction was this is going to make teams like Vet Guard and Pathfinders overpowered and there's nothing we can do about it. But actually when I was thinking about it, both of those teams have mechanics in their tool set to be able to get around this anyway. So the Vet Guard has the spotter, which is better than Vantage, and it lets them use their sniper in a way to potentially kill someone in heavy cover, which is far more effective. Now, there's an element of, by giving them that extra height and vantage point, they get better lines of visibility to be able to then actually go and do that, potentially. But overall, if you don't let them do that as an option, they can still do it from the corner of heavy cover elsewhere on the board. And Pathfinders, well, they just marker light to 5 marker lights. That's the exact same effect as being on the vantage point, because it gets you out of light cover, but not heavy. So both of those teams have those mechanics to be able to get around this problem anyway, and therefore it's difficult to be able to actually hurt those teams without hurting other teams. And I think that this change really affects the teams that don't have those mechanics. So teams like Kazakin, Corsairs, Wormblade are the teams that are actually being most supported by this, and obviously Crew as well, because those are the teams that can potentially get on those vantage points and use that light cover as a shooting platform and not necessarily get too punished for it. But what I will say is that if your board is potentially designed poorly, then this will be like a magnification of that problem, right? So if you've just got only light cover in the mid board, and it's a long distance between both the board edges, having someone on a vantage point in cover is going to be just horrible with a silent weapon. You're not going to be able to get close to them to be able to remove them, and you're not going to be able to play around it. So part of the map design that I tried to do was make it so that the teams that could do that are doing it in a way which is costing them something. So it's costing them a scouting option, but it's also still potentially in an area that's threatening. And most of the area it's going to look over is going to be an area with heavy cover. And there's all sorts of nooks and crannies you have to look at when you're playing with a map. And then when you actually draw those lines of visibility, you'll see that those vantage points don't necessarily overlook the objective in the way that you might think it does, or potentially the angle that you're looking at it from the vantage point, there's heavy cover, and then you have to get right around a different angle to be able to shoot them. And with some smart barricade play, you can maybe make that safe as well. So that was kind of the thought process when making those maps. And if you want to have a look at them, they're available on a link that I'll add to this YouTube video and the rest of it, and on our link tree. But we also have a slightly different product, because obviously that's for people who play primarily on open board in real life, and they want to be able to get out and do that. But we talked at the beginning of the episode about how important TTS can be as a tool to be able to get you prepped for a tournament and understand all aspects of a game. And clearly, we have someone who has done a whole load of time at TTS and put a whole lot of effort in doing it and made a whole bunch of maps as well. So there is also on TTS, if you go on Clostry's Corner Workshop, is that the best way to get on it, Clostry?
Yeah, so I try to, well, not just try, I do. I scanned every figure I have for Killteam. So at the moment, I think I have like 17 teams up, because I have some compendium teams as well. Every possible model that you would have on a roster, I try to build, magnetize, etc., and then just scan them and upload them to a TTS mod. You have a wide selection for models. Also, we have a pretty amazing base table provided by Monkey Mod, was one of the bigger modders that have done the work, but he wasn't alone. I just can't recall the other guys, and I'm sorry for that. And it's really easy to set up the board and start playing. Easier than doing it in real life, actually.
Because you also have all of the terrain maps as well that you've made, right? So they can import those straight in, and they'll work with the board.
I made every type of terrain pack for the new critical ops missions. I'm not guaranteeing they are 100% perfect, because I didn't have the time to playtest them, but I sort of have the same design thought process that you have, Ryan. They're trying to trying to have something in the middle, a big heavy piece to provide obscurity and heavy cover when moving up. As you already mentioned, it's really important to have super vantage points from where you can just see everything on the board. So I try to keep those in my mind when designing the maps. And with those, the new barricade options to put them on vantages are not so overpowered, but I can see the other side of the argument as well, that you can abuse them with a small selection of teams. Even if it comes to Redguard and Pathfinders, if you can put your snipers up on a vantage behind cover, you don't have to invest resources to make those good shots. So you might use your spotter with your plasma gunner, for example, or your grenade launcher. Or when it comes to Pathfinders, you have your sniper up, and you don't have to mark or light a target if there's a valid target for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can invest those resources into other figures. So I see that as well.
I definitely understand both sides of the argument, because it is significantly harder to make a map that works when your opponent can do that. Because in the past, and it was a pretty well-trodden route for most of us in the London wargaming community, is you would rotate the buildings and you would have exposed vantage points, and that was the way the game was played. And it made map design, I think, it was still hard, but easier, knowing that your opponent couldn't do that sort of thing. But I've had to sort of break some of those what were previously core rules, where you would never do that normally, because that would be bad, to try and make it work and to try and make it so that the maps play around those abilities. Because the problem is that each time we deviate from the rules slightly, we will end up playing a slightly different game. And it might be that if we tweak the rules in a certain way in one community, we go, oh, well, actually in Spain, for instance, maybe Pathfinders and Vetguard aren't doing too good, and then they start receiving buffs. But then in a different community, let's say in London, they're absolutely dominant, and in the US they're doing something else, and in Poland they're doing something else, and it makes it very hard to understand where we're all at when it comes to balanced data slates and all that sort of stuff, and understand how teams are performing. But conversely to that, I also understand it's your first time playing the game, and you have this what appears to be a unsolvable problem for you that's right in the middle of your field of view, and every turn it's going to kill someone, and that can be really tough to deal with as a new player, because you think, how am I going to get rid of that? I think with map design, you have to try and build those the methods to get models across the board where you can. So again, making the mid board more interesting so that people can get this close range, like skirmish fighting that we're after. So I'm interested to see what the feedback's like, because obviously we talked about playtesting. I did a bit of playtesting with my maps. I was able to get them down the local club, and I was always saying to people, do you mind if I play test this against you? And I went to various tournaments, said, oh, is it okay if we play test one of my maps when we're setting up terrain, that sort of thing. And people were really, really happy to do that, which is awesome. So I've learned a few things, hopefully, about map packs, but it's only when you put it out there, and you get a huge data set, then testing it and really trying to break it, that you can then see if it was good or bad, So it might be that a month from now we release version 2 of the map pack and I have to completely rechange it because there's a way that you can break a certain map with a certain combo that I haven't seen. And the other thing as well is that, Games Workshop keep releasing new teams. And it might be that in a few months' time there's a team that can do something that we didn't prepare for when making the map, and then before you know it, it's now bad map design where before it was good. Because a perfect example is Intercession. They came across probably the first team that I'm aware of with long range blast that could ignore obscurity. So they jump up, they all specs, and they shoot, and there's not too much you can do about it. So you used to have these light terrain pieces protected by obscurity in your deployment that now Intercession can just pop Devastator Doctrine. And we talked about Alpha Strikes earlier on, how strong they are, and just bam, turn one, smack you with that straight away. So I think that's an interesting thing, and it is, as you say, we can see both sides of the argument, right? Both sides of the debate, and I don't think necessarily one side is right or wrong. I think it's just that's the game we have currently. Let's learn to see if we can play with it and find as the competitive players, find the solutions within the tool sets we have before we change the tools, I guess. Connor, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what's your point of view?
My knee-jerk reaction is it's your tournament, do what you want. As long as everyone's happy with the rules, it's a game. Everyone can play the game and enjoy it. But I would point out that the new Fortify step explicitly says put this on a vantage point. So this was clearly the intent of the game designers when they made this change. Where we've seen other changes beforehand, so I'm thinking back in the day we had a LWG tournament, and we said maybe for this tournament let's just let Pathfinders do worthy cause just the once, and everyone agreed on it, and we tried it for fairness. But the basis of that was we think Worthy Cause is too powerful, and the game testers perhaps didn't realise quite how powerful it was. Whereas with this one, it's clearly designed to be fortified on a vantage point. So it's an interesting one with me, but ultimately, if everyone's happy playing that way, just crack on, have fun with it.
I think it's actually a really good discussion for the comment section, so like what are you guys thinking about it yourselves when you're playing your competitive matches? Are you finding that those fortified barricades are really dominating the meta? Like, are they forcing you to completely change your play style or pick new teams as a result? Or are you finding that actually it's just made the scouting step more interesting, and now you're seeing less people take the infiltrate option or the scouting phase dash or something like that, because actually now they've got a bit more choice between it? Because I mean, pretty routinely, I was always taking the infiltrate option unless I wanted to try and force initiative, and now there's a little bit more to it. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. So it'd be interesting to know what you guys think out there. Obviously, in the comments, let us know your thoughts, because I'm interested to hear them as well. And I said I don't necessarily think there's a right or a wrong answer in this, but it'd be interesting to see what the community thinks, because then potentially you can see what's the lived experience and how does that affect people's enjoyment of the game is probably a better way of looking at it than necessarily just from a purely competitive vantage point of view. So that'd be interesting to see. And as I said, if you want to have a look at the map packs, they're there and they're available, and hopefully they might help solve a little bit of that problem, so you're not getting sniped off the board immediately turn one, and that might make it play a little better and feel a little better as well going forwards. All right, Connor, do you want to go into our sort of weekly segment on MetaWatch? Do you have any interesting stats that you think might be worthwhile throwing out there?
Yeah, we had like a quick glance, didn't we, earlier on? And just one of the things that caught our eye is that in terms of elite teams seem to be occupying roughly 33% of the meta. So a third of your games in tournaments are probably going to be against an elite team. Now, that's quite an interesting stat in itself, I think. When you're thinking about your team and who you're going to play, you need to at least consider one of your matches being against an elite side.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a really good point. Is like that's a great stat to take away and just think about and go, okay, so at least a third of the matches are going to be elite focus, and that's going to be something interesting that we see when like the new teams like Arbites are coming out, when we know they're not particularly successful versus elite teams, and we talked about Kroot as well, and we understand that they're not necessarily successful as well. So I think that's quite a cool little stat to leave the show on, in a sense that think about the fact that when you're looking at those stats, that's probably going to be what you're going to look at, and that's probably going to be what you're fighting at least a third of your games. If you go to a 4-round tournament, you're expecting 1 or 2 of your games to be against an elite team, and that's not including Harlequins, is it, or Void Dancers, Connor? So if you those are sort of like pseudo elite as well, I guess. So between those those teams, it's almost 40% of the meta, I think, or getting close to.
It's a high number.
Yeah, like a high number of the meta is looking like it's going to be an elite focus. So some interesting stats to come out of that. All right, so I think that's going to bring us to the end of this episode, and hopefully you found something new or useful while listening. If you did, throwing us a like, I say, would be greatly appreciated, but you can help us even more just by hitting that subscribe button and getting us to those 1,000 subscribers. That would really appreciate. We'd really appreciate that, and it'll help us out a lot. And if you can't wait and you do want early access, we have a Patreon where you can get exclusive access to all the content ahead of time. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so drop us a comment below and we'll get right to you. Connor, do you have any final remarks before we move on to Laurie? Any final remarks you might have?
Just wanted to remind everyone that Laurie's throwing down the gauntlet over at the Hungarian Golden Ticket event. Laurie, do you want to remind us details of that?
Details are still getting ironed out. At the moment, we're aiming for June 3rd and 4th, so the first weekend of June. Probably it will be a 2-day event, maybe in the LGT format with 4 rounds with first aid and top 8 cut, but it's still in debates. I don't really want to give it away too early. The place seems amazing. We'd love to have you guys there. The more the merrier. Come and beat our asses. What we will be there. I will be there.
But it's certain that you're taking Phabos, yeah?
Not to that tournament, no.
Oh, well, he's obviously saving that one for the Hyrotech, so that makes sense. So, well, if you guys want to come and play against Clostry's Hyrotech at the Hungary GT or Major, maybe we'll see how many people can turn up. Then we'll keep you posted on all the details for that. I'm going to try and collate a calendar of all the European and maybe even global events, and we'll share that with everyone so you guys can see what's going on near you. That's going to bring us to the end of that episode because we've kept Clostry on way later than we expected to with various technical snags and issues. So very much appreciate your time once again for coming on and sharing all those tactical tips. It's been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And to the audience, thank you so much for listening. This has been Turning Point Tactics. I've been your host, Ryan, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
See ya.